Yo, what's up everybody? Today we are here to drop some serious knowledge about a struggle that shook the world, Apartheid. This ain't just some history lesson, fam. This is about humanity, about justice, about the resilience of a people who said, nah, we ain't having it. Imagine a world where your skin color determines your entire life, where you can't live, work, or even love who you want. Sounds crazy, right? But that was the reality in South Africa for decades. This is the story of Apartheid, the systematic segregation and discrimination that gripped South Africa. We're diving deep, fam, into the heart of this struggle, unveiling the stories of courage, resilience, and the ultimate triumph over oppression. Get ready to be inspired, because this is a story you won't forget. Let's rewind the clock way back. Before the European settlers arrived, South Africa was a vibrant tapestry of diverse cultures and languages. We're talking about the cradle of humankind, the birthplace of humanity. The San people, some of the oldest inhabitants of the region, lived in harmony with nature. They were skilled hunters and gatherers, their lives deeply intertwined with the land. Then came the Bantu-speaking groups, bringing with them their own rich traditions, languages, and agricultural practices. These communities thrived, creating societies rich in art, music, and storytelling. The land was their lifeblood, and they respected its bounty. It was a world of balance, a world of community. But as we all know, history has a way of taking unexpected turns. Change was blowing in from across the ocean. Europeans, driven by a thirst for exploration and, let's be real, exploitation, arrived on South African shores. At first, it was just a trickle, a few ships looking for spices and new trade routes, but soon the trickle turned into a flood. The Europeans, particularly the Dutch and the British, saw the fertile land and abundant resources of South Africa as ripe for the taking. They started claiming land, pushing the indigenous populations aside. This wasn't just about land, though, it was about power. The Europeans saw themselves as superior, believing they had a right to rule over the indigenous people. And that, my friends, is where our story takes a dark turn. The seeds of apartheid, of segregation and discrimination were sown. The arrival of European settlers in South Africa marked a turning point, a seismic shift in the region's history. The Dutch, arriving in the 17th century, established a foothold at the Cape of Good Hope. They weren't interested in integration, no sir. They saw themselves as the superior race, bringing civilization to what they considered a savage land. These settlers, known as Afrikaners, began to establish their own rules, their own laws. They pushed the indigenous populations off their ancestral lands, herding them into smaller and smaller areas. This wasn't just about space, it was about power. The Afrikaners wanted control, and they were willing to take it by force. The indigenous people, faced with this new threat, resisted. They fought back against this encroachment on their land, their way of life. But the Europeans, with their advanced weaponry and ruthlessness, were a formidable force. The stage was set for a clash of cultures, a clash that would have devastating consequences for generations to come. Section 2, the Great Trek, Land Grab and Displacement. As more Europeans arrived, the pressure on land intensified. The Afrikaners, feeling crowded and seeking even more territory, embarked on what became known as the Great Trek. This wasn't some leisurely stroll through the countryside, no, this was a mass migration fueled by a sense of entitlement and a lust for land. They moved inland, pushing deeper into South Africa, encountering new groups of indigenous people along the way. The Zulu kingdom, a powerful and well-organized empire, resisted fiercely. Led by the legendary King Shaka, the Zulus fought bravely against the encroaching settlers. But the Afrikaners, armed with guns and driven by a belief in their own destiny, were relentless. They crushed the resistance, seizing vast tracts of land and displacing countless indigenous communities. The Great Trek wasn't just a migration, it was a land grab of epic proportions. It was a key step in the process of dispossession that lay at the heart of apartheid. Section 3, segregation, takes root, dividing to conquer. With their grip on power tightening, the Europeans began to formalize their control over South Africa. They established laws and policies aimed at separating the races, at ensuring white supremacy. This wasn't just about prejudice, it was about power, plain and simple. The discovery of diamonds and gold in South Africa in the late 19th century only intensified this process. The Europeans rushed to exploit these riches, using their newfound wealth to further cement their control. They needed a large labour force to work the mines and farms, and they found it in the indigenous population. But this wasn't about fair wages or decent working conditions. This was about exploitation, about using black South Africans as a source of cheap labour to fuel their economic engine. The concept of divide and conquer became central to their strategy. They deliberately sowed divisions among the different indigenous groups, using those divisions to maintain their own power. Section 4. The colour bar opportunities denied. As segregation became more entrenched, so too did the idea of white supremacy. Black South Africans were increasingly relegated to the margins of society. They were denied access to education, to healthcare, to decent housing. The message was clear: your skin colour determined your worth. The colour bar wasn't just a social construct, it was written into law. Laws were passed that restricted where black South Africans could live, work and even travel. They couldn't own land in white areas, and they were forced to carry passes that controlled their movements. This system of racial oppression didn't happen overnight. It was a gradual process, a slow tightening of the screws that culminated in the formalization of Apartheid in 1948. But even in the face of this brutal system, the spirit of resistance never died. The seeds of defiance were being sown, and a new generation of leaders would soon emerge to challenge the very foundations of apartheid. The early 20th century saw a surge in Afrikaner nationalism. These descendants of the original Dutch settlers felt increasingly marginalized, their language and culture overshadowed by the British. Remember, South Africa was under British rule at this point, and the Afrikaners, despite their dominance over the indigenous population, chafed under the Union Jack. This wasn't just about language or culture, though it was about power. The Afrikaners resented British economic dominance and yearned for a return to the days when they called the shots. They saw themselves as the rightful heirs to South Africa, destined to rule over the land and its people. This burgeoning nationalism found a voice in the National Party, a political party that rose to prominence in the 1930s and 40s. The National Party tapped into the anxieties and resentments of the Afrikaner population, promising them a return to their rightful place. Their message resonated with many white South Africans who felt threatened by the changing demographics and the prospect of black majority rule. It was a potent mix of fear, prejudice and a yearning for a bygone era. The year 1948 marked a turning point in South African history, the year apartheid became official government policy. The National Party, capitalizing on white fears and anxieties, swept to victory in the general election on a platform of racial segregation. They wasted no time in translating their ideology into law. Apartheid, meaning separateness in Africans, was more than just segregation. It was a comprehensive system of racial classification and control designed to ensure white minority rule in perpetuity. One by one, laws were passed that touched every aspect of life. The Population Registration Act categorized every South African by race, from white at the top to Bantu, black Africans, at the bottom. This wasn't just some bureaucratic exercise. It determined where you could live, who you could marry, what jobs you could hold, and even how much you were allowed to earn. The Group Areas Act, another cornerstone of apartheid legislation, carved up cities and towns into racially designated zones. Black South Africans were forcibly removed from their homes, often with brutal efficiency, and herded into overcrowded townships, far from economic opportunities and basic amenities. Life under apartheid was a daily assault on human dignity for black South Africans. Every aspect of their existence was controlled, restricted and policed. The pass laws, for example, required black South Africans to carry identification documents at all times. Failure to produce these passes on demand could result in arrest, detention or worse. Education too became a tool of oppression. The Bantu Education Act of 1953 created a separate and inferior education system for black South Africans, designed to train them for menial labour. The curriculum was deliberately skewed, emphasizing manual skills over critical thinking or academic pursuits. Black South Africans were denied access to quality healthcare, forced to rely on overcrowded and understaffed hospitals in their townships. Economic opportunities were severely limited, with most black South Africans relegated to low-paying, unskilled jobs. The message was clear. Black South Africans were second-class citizens in their own land, their lives and aspirations deemed insignificant by the apartheid regime. Section 4. A land divided, the homelands policy. The apartheid government's cruelty knew no bounds. Not content with controlling every aspect of black South Africans' lives, they went a step further with the implementation of the homelands policy. This diabolical scheme aimed to strip black South Africans of their citizenship and confine them to designated areas, euphemistically called homelands or bantustans. These homelands were, in reality, overcrowded and impoverished rural areas, lacking basic infrastructure and economic opportunities. They were strategically located on marginal land, often far from urban centres and industrial areas. Millions of black South Africans were forcibly relocated to these homelands, their ancestral lands confiscated and their communities torn apart. The true purpose of the homelands policy was to create a source of cheap labour for white-owned farms and industries, while simultaneously reducing the black population in white South Africa. It was a cynical attempt to create a system of apartheid by another name, a system where black South Africans would be stripped of their citizenship and confined to impoverished enclaves. Section 5. Defiance in the face of oppression, the seeds of resistance. Despite the brutal realities of apartheid, the spirit of resistance burned brightly. Black South Africans organised, mobilised and fought back against apartheid. The African National Congress, formed in 1912, emerged as a leading voice. The defiance campaign of the early 1950s marked a turning point. They defied segregation laws and challenged apartheid. The government responded with brutal force. The seeds of a long struggle had been sown. The Sharpeville massacre and its aftermath. The year 1960 etched a scar on South Africa's soul. March 21st, Sharpeville. Thousands of black South Africans peacefully protesting the hated pass laws. They sang freedom songs, their voices a chorus of defiance. But the apartheid regime chose brutality over dialogue. Without warning, police opened fire on the unarmed crowd. 69 people died that day, yearning for freedom. Sharpeville sent shockwaves across the world. The ANC realized non-violent resistance alone wouldn't dismantle apartheid. Section 2. The armed struggle. Umkhonto we Sizwe and the turn to violence. Faced with the unyielding brutality of the apartheid regime, the ANC and its allies made a momentous decision to take up arms against their oppressors. In 1961, Umkhonto we Sizwe, the armed wing of the ANC, was born. Nelson Mandela, once a proponent of non-violent resistance, embraced the necessity of armed struggle. MK's early targets were symbolic, attacks on government installations and infrastructure, designed to cripple the economy and expose the vulnerability of the apartheid state. They were not about targeting civilians, they were about sending a message that apartheid would be met with resistance by any means necessary. The government responded with predictable ferocity. State security forces, empowered by draconian laws, launched a brutal crackdown on dissent. ANC leaders were arrested, tortured and imprisoned. Mandela himself was captured in 1962 and sentenced to life in prison, becoming a global icon of resistance, even as he languished behind bars. Section 3. The world takes notice: sanctions, boycotts and international condemnation. The world, once content to turn a blind eye to the horrors of apartheid, could no longer ignore the cries for justice emanating from South Africa. The Sharpeville massacre and the subsequent crackdown on dissent sparked international outrage. The United Nations condemned apartheid as a crime against humanity. Countries around the world imposed economic sanctions on South Africa, hitting the apartheid regime where it hurt their wallets. Sports boycotts isolated South Africa on the international stage, a powerful symbol of their pariah status. Musicians, artists, and cultural icons joined the chorus of condemnation. The world was waking up to the injustice of apartheid, and they were using their voices to demand change. The struggle for freedom in South Africa was no longer just a local affair, it had become a global movement for justice and equality. Section 4. The Children Rise Up, Soweto 1976, and a Generation Awakened. June 16, 1976. Soweto, a sprawling township outside Johannesburg, became a crucible of resistance, a testament to the courage of a generation that refused to be silenced. Thousands of schoolchildren took to the streets, protesting the imposition of Afrikaans, the language of the oppressor, as the medium of instruction in their schools. They marched peacefully, their youthful energy a stark contrast to the grim realities of life under apartheid. But the police, as always, were waiting. They opened fire on the unarmed students, their bullets cutting down children in cold blood. Hector Peterson, a 13-year-old boy, became the face of the Soweto uprising, his lifeless body carried through the streets, a symbol of the apartheid regime's brutality. The Soweto uprising ignited a firestorm of anger and resistance that swept across South Africa. A new generation, radicalized by the events of that day, joined the struggle for freedom, determined to dismantle apartheid by any means necessary. Section 5. Cracks in the wall, the collapse of apartheid's facade. The 1980s witnessed a steady erosion of apartheid's foundations. International pressure intensified, sanctions began to bite, and the South African economy teetered on the brink of collapse. Inside South Africa, the resistance movement gained momentum. The ANC, despite being banned and operating underground, remained a powerful symbol of defiance. Trade unions, emboldened by the spirit of resistance, organized crippling strikes, bringing the economy to a standstill. The apartheid government, facing mounting pressure both domestically and internationally, resorted to increasingly desperate measures. They declared states of emergency, granting sweeping powers to the security forces. Townships became battlegrounds, patrolled by heavily armed police and soldiers. But the writing was on the wall. Apartheid, morally bankrupt and economically unsustainable, was living on borrowed time. The world was watching, and the tide of history was turning against the apartheid regime. Section 6. Negotiations and the dawn of democracy. Mandela's walk to freedom. By the late 1980s, even the most ardent defenders of apartheid realized that change was inevitable. The government, under the leadership of F.W. de Klerk, began secret talks with Nelson Mandela, still imprisoned on Robben Island. In 1990, after 27 years behind bars, Mandela walked free, his release met with jubilation across South Africa and around the world. The dismantling of apartheid began in earnest. Political prisoners were released, discriminatory laws were repealed, and negotiations for a new constitution began. The road to democracy was not without its challenges. Violence flared between rival political factions, threatening to derail the fragile peace. But the desire for a just and equitable South Africa ultimately prevailed. On April 27, 1994, South Africa held its first democratic elections. Millions of black South Africans, many voting for the first time in their lives, lined up to cast their ballots. The ANC, led by Nelson Mandela, swept to victory, ushering in a new era of hope and reconciliation. Section 1. Mandela, symbol of hope and forgiveness. All right, fam, let's talk about the big man himself, Nelson Mandela. This dude wasn't just a leader. He was a symbol of hope, a beacon of light in the darkest of times. Imagine spending 27 years, prime years of your life, locked up just for fighting for what's right. That's some serious commitment right there. But here's the thing about Mandela that really blows my mind. He walked out of prison, not bitter, not vengeful, but with a message of forgiveness and reconciliation. He knew that true freedom couldn't exist without healing the wounds of the past. He could have easily called for revenge, for payback for all the years stolen, the lives lost. But he chose a different path, a path of unity and forgiveness. Mandela understood that building a new South Africa required everyone, black and white, to work together. His leadership, his unwavering belief in the human spirit, was instrumental in guiding South Africa through a peaceful transition to democracy. Mandela showed the world that even in the face of unimaginable cruelty, hope and forgiveness can prevail. Section 2. The mothers of the nation's strength and resilience personified. Now let's give some serious props to the women of the struggle, the mothers of the nation. These women, often working behind the scenes, were the backbone of the anti-apartheid movement. They kept the spirit of resistance alive, even when times were toughest. We're talking about women like Winnie Mandela, a fierce and outspoken activist who kept Nelson's name alive during his imprisonment, even as she faced constant harassment and detention by the authorities. Her courage and resilience inspired millions. Then there were women like Albertina Sisulu and Ruth First, fearless leaders who challenged the apartheid regime, organized protests and mobilized communities. They risked their lives and their freedom to fight for a just and equitable South Africa. These women weren't just fighting against apartheid, they were fighting for their families, for their children's futures. They knew that a society built on inequality and injustice could never truly thrive. Their strength, their unwavering belief in the power of collective action played a pivotal role in bringing apartheid to its knees. Let's not forget about the young people, the students who said, "Enough is enough." They were the ones on the front lines, facing down police brutality, risking their lives for a future they might not live to see. Remember Soweto, 1976? Those were kids, man. Kids who knew that an education designed to keep them down wasn't an education at all. They stood up, they marched, they faced the full force of the apartheid regime's brutality, and they changed the course of history. The youth brought a raw energy, a fearlessness to the struggle. They grew up under apartheid, knew nothing else, but they refused to accept it as their fate. They formed student organizations, spread awareness and challenged the status quo at every turn. Their activism, their willingness to put their lives on the line, served as a constant reminder that the fight for freedom was far from over. They were the voice of a generation demanding change, a generation that refused to be silenced. Section 4. The unsung heroes' everyday acts of defiance. You know, it wasn't just the big names, the famous leaders who brought down apartheid. It was the everyday heroes, the ordinary people who, in their own small ways, chipped away at the system. We're talking about the mothers who risked arrest by sending their kids to white schools, the workers who went on strike, risking their jobs to demand fair treatment, the teachers who defied the Bantu education system and taught their students the truth. These acts of defiance, these everyday acts of courage, might seem small in the grand scheme of things, but they were crucial in undermining apartheid's grip on society. They showed the world that the human spirit could not be broken, that the thirst for freedom and equality burned brightly, even in the darkest of times. It's a reminder that even in the face of overwhelming injustice, even when the odds seem stacked against us, we all have the power to make a difference. It's about standing up for what's right, speaking out against oppression, and never ever giving up hope. So we've journeyed through the darkness of apartheid, witnessed the resilience of a people determined to break free, but the story doesn't end there. The legacy of the struggle lives on, a reminder of the human cost of prejudice and the power of collective action. Today, South Africa stands as a beacon of hope, a testament to the possibility of transformation, even after decades of oppression. But the journey is far from over. The scars of apartheid run deep, and the fight for true equality and justice continues. We owe it to the heroes of the struggle, to those who sacrificed so much, to never forget their sacrifices. We must learn from their courage, their unwavering belief in the power of unity and forgiveness. The struggle against injustice continues in different forms in different parts of the world. Let the story of South Africa serve as a reminder that we all have a role to play in building a more just and equitable world for all. We've travelled through history, witnessed resilience and arrived at a new South Africa. The Rainbow Nation, born from apartheid's ashes, held so much promise. Mandela's release felt like a fairy tale ending to a brutal chapter. But dismantling apartheid wasn't easy. Rebuilding was like reconstructing after a hurricane. There have been incredible strides, like the right to vote, Seeing people of all colours mingling freely is a testament to change. But has freedom's promise been fully realised? That's a complex conversation. South Africa today is a land of contrasts. Gleaming skyscrapers and a thriving economy symbolise progress, but nearby, townships grapple with poverty and inequality. The ghosts of apartheid linger in economic disparities. Corruption erodes trust and hinders progress. Amidst challenges, there's hope and determination. Young South Africans demand change and accountability. The fight for equality is a marathon, not a sprint. You know, there's this beautiful word in Zulu and Xhosa, Ubuntu. It speaks to the interconnectedness of humanity, the idea that I am because we are. It's about compassion and understanding, recognizing our fates are intertwined. Ubuntu holds the key, not just for South Africa, but for the world, because at the end of the day, we're all in this together.